What drives a man, a husband, a father, to kill the very people he's supposed to love and protect? It's a question that chills us to the core because it strikes at the heart of trust, of family, of safety. And tonight, we're not looking at strangers or serial killers lurking in the shadows. We're looking at men who lived in suburban neighborhoods, who smiled for cameras, who said, "I love you" before bed, and then turned their homes into crime scenes. Two names stand out as symbols of this horror: Scott Peterson and Chris Watts. Scott Peterson, whose wife Lacey and unborn son vanished on Christmas Eve of 2002. For months, Scott appeared before cameras as the worried husband, until the truth of his double life unraveled. Chris Watts, who in 2018 murdered his pregnant wife Shanann and their 2 young daughters. He too gave interviews, begging for their return, while hiding the darkest secret imaginable. 2 men, separated by more than a decade, but bound together by psychology, by patterns of deception, by chillingly similar motives. Both presented themselves as perfect husbands. Both pursued affairs behind their wives' backs. Both craved escape from responsibility. And both, when cornered, made the unthinkable choice. In this episode, we'll step inside their minds. We'll peel back the mask of normalcy. We'll ask whether they were narcissists, sociopaths, or simply selfish men. And we'll explore what their crimes reveal about the psychology of family annihilators. Men who kill not for money, not for greed, not even for hatred, but to erase the life they once built. Before we begin, if you're new here, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell. This isn't just storytelling. This is deep investigation, connecting psychology with true crime. And if you want to go even further, consider joining as a channel member. Members get early access, behind-the-scenes breakdowns, and even the chance to suggest future cases we cover. Now, let's begin our journey into the disturbing psychology of family killers. This is Scott Peterson versus Chris Watts, the perfect husband or the perfect lie. The perfect husband illusion. On the surface, Scott Peterson and Chris Watts looked like any other suburban husbands. Both smiled for photographs with their wives. Both showed up to family gatherings and holidays. Both outwardly embraced the role of fatherhood. They were men you would pass on the street and never think twice about. That's precisely why their stories still haunt us. Because the monsters didn't look like monsters. They looked like neighbors. Scott and Lacey lived in Modesto, California. They owned a modest home, decorated for Christmas in December of 2002. Scott played golf, joked with friends, and to everyone who knew them, seemed excited about becoming a father. Lacey's friends described her as glowing, thrilled about the arrival of baby Connor. To outsiders, they seemed like the picture of young love building a future together. Chris and Shanann, meanwhile, built their lives in Frederick, Colorado. Their house was tidy, their lawn trimmed, their social media feeds full of family photos and videos. Shanann was the outgoing one, the planner, the woman who kept everything in motion. Chris appeared quieter, more reserved, but his smile in Shanann's videos told a story of a man who loved his daughters deeply. Neighbors waved as he loaded his truck for work. Friends saw a family on the rise, building stability, preparing to welcome another child. Yet this outward presentation was exactly that, a presentation. What psychologists call the mask of normalcy. A mask is not always a deliberate performance. Sometimes it's a coping mechanism, a way to present the self we wish were real. But for men like Scott Peterson and Chris Watts, the mask wasn't just a shield, it was a weapon. It was used to hide growing resentment, dissatisfaction, and ultimately, murderous intent. Think about what this mask meant. For Scott, it meant telling his in-laws that everything was fine while privately telling a mistress that he was a widower. For Chris, it meant filming cutesy gender reveal videos while secretly planning a future with someone else. It meant maintaining 2 parallel realities, one for the world and one for themselves. And here's the key. Both men were praised for their masks. Friends described Scott as charming, polite, likable. People saw him as a man who had his life together, attractive and steady. Chris was described by neighbors as a quiet but devoted dad, a man who played with his daughters on the driveway, who never caused trouble. Their communities reinforced their masks, validating their outward image, which made it easier to hide the truth. But behind that mask, there were signs. For Scott, those signs were small comments to friends, remarks about not being ready for fatherhood, about feeling trapped. He was never openly cruel to Lacey in public, but privately, he began to detach. His golf outings became longer, his emotional investment thinner. For Chris, the cracks showed in text messages. Shannon reached out repeatedly, expressing her confusion, her desperation. She told him she didn't feel loved, that she felt him slipping away. And how did Chris respond? With silence, with one-word answers, with coldness so sharp it left Shannon reeling. These weren't just mood swings. This was the mask beginning to crack. The psychology behind this is profound. Family annihilators often struggle with cognitive dissonance, the tension of holding two conflicting realities. On one side, the role of husband and father. On the other, the desire for freedom, excitement, escape. Most people resolve this tension by choosing honesty or by finding healthier ways to address dissatisfaction. But Scott and Chris resolved it through deception. They doubled down on the mask, keeping the world convinced everything was fine while nurturing fantasies of another life. This duality is what makes them so chilling. Because in the presence of their wives, their children, their friends, they could maintain the performance. They could smile, laugh, pose for photos. And yet, inside, their resentment grew. Chris resented Shannon's control over finances, her strong personality, her constant energy that made him feel small. Scott resented Lacey's excitement for motherhood, which to him felt like a cage closing in. This resentment wasn't explosive. It didn't show up as shouting matches or public fights. Instead, it showed up as detachment. Scott spending more time away, Chris spending more time on his phone. 1,000 small withdrawals that, piece by piece, revealed that the mask wasn't real. And here's what's terrifying. For a long time, no one noticed. Neighbors didn't see it. Friends didn't suspect. Even family members thought the marriages looked stable. The illusion was so strong that when the truth came out, the betrayal wasn't just of their wives and children. It was of entire communities who believed in the mask. The perfect husband illusion is a powerful psychological defense. It allows men like Scott and Chris to maintain external admiration while internally detaching. It provides them cover while they plan their escape. And it blinds those closest to them. Because who wants to believe that the man smiling in family photos could also be the man planning murder? By late 2002, Lacey's family still believed in Scott's mask. By the summer of 2018, Shannon still clung to the hope that Chris was just going through a phase. Both women loved deeply. Both wanted to believe in their marriages. And both, tragically, were still invested in the illusion long after their husbands had abandoned it. And that's the cruelest part of the perfect husband illusion. It doesn't just deceive the outside world. It deceives the victims themselves. It convinces wives to stay, to fight, to hope, even when the truth is staring them in the face. Because when you've built your life around someone, believing the mask is easier than admitting the nightmare. Scott and Chris wore their masks until the very end. But when the masks finally slipped, what they revealed was not ordinary discontent. It was double lives, fueled by affairs, lies, and fantasies of freedom. And that brings us to the next stage in their unraveling, the escape hatch of infidelity. Affairs and escaping reality. If the mask of the perfect husband was the first act in Scott Peterson's and Chris Watts' stories, the affairs were the second. Because beneath the illusion of stability, both men sought escape routes. Both turned to other women not just for companionship, but for validation, excitement, and above all, freedom. Affairs are common in family annihilator cases. They are not always about love or passion. Often, they are about escape, about constructing a fantasy life where responsibility doesn't exist, where fatherhood and commitment can be erased, where the man can be whoever he wants to be without consequence. For Scott and Chris, affairs were less about attraction to another person and more about attraction to another identity, the single man, free and unburdened. Scott Peterson's affair with Amber Frey began in November of 2002, just weeks before Lacey's disappearance. To Amber, he presented himself as a grieving man, claiming his wife had died months earlier. Imagine the audacity of that lie. Scott was married, his wife alive and pregnant, yet he was telling another woman that he was a widower. For Scott, the affair wasn't just betrayal, it was performance. He relished the role of the tragic, available man. He built an entirely new reality for Amber, one where Lacey and Connor didn't exist. And the longer he maintained this lie, the more powerful it became. Chris Watts followed a strikingly similar pattern with Nichol Kessinger. In 2018, he began seeing Nichol secretly, telling her he was in the process of divorcing Shanann. He promised her a new life together. He spoke of a fresh start, free from responsibility, free from the obligations of fatherhood and marriage. To Nichol, he was attentive, affectionate, and full of energy. To Shanann, he was cold, withdrawn, silent. The duality here is critical. Affairs allowed both men to maintain two realities, one where they were family men and one where they were bachelors. Each role fulfilled different needs. The family role gave them social validation. They looked good to neighbors, co-workers, extended family. The bachelor role gave them emotional validation. They felt desired, admired, free. But here's the danger. These two realities cannot coexist indefinitely. Eventually, they collide. And when they do, men like Scott and Chris are forced to choose. Some choose divorce. Some choose honesty. But family annihilators? They choose elimination. Psychologists call this the escape fantasy. It is the belief that one can simply step out of one life and into another, as though responsibilities and relationships can be erased. For Scott, Amber represented freedom. He could flirt, travel, live as though he had no ties. For Chris, Nichol represented a new beginning, one where he wasn't overshadowed by Shanann, one where he wasn't bound by fatherhood. In both cases, the affair wasn't the cause of the murder, but it was the accelerant. Look at the way Scott lied. He didn't just tell Amber small untruths. He told her his wife was dead. That level of deceit reveals a man who wasn't just hiding infidelity. He was rehearsing a world where Lacey no longer existed. Every time he repeated the lie, he normalized it. Every time Amber believed him, he was rewarded. It was practice for the mask he would later wear when speaking to police, to cameras, to Lacey's family. To Chris's lies to Nichol were just as chilling. He told her his marriage was over, that he was leaving Shanann, that they had no future together. Yet Shanann was texting him daily, begging for his attention, planning their baby's arrival. To live in such dual realities requires compartmentalization, a psychological skill where a person separates contradictory experiences so completely that they can function without guilt. But compartmentalization has limits. And when the compartments collapse, the pressure can explode. Affairs also provided both men with something else, validation. Scott's relationship with Amber made him feel wanted, admired, important. Chris's relationship with Nichol made him feel attractive, strong, desirable. In their marriages, both men felt trapped or diminished. In their affairs, they felt powerful. That contrast widened the gap between their realities, making their home lives feel unbearable and their fantasies feel intoxicating. The psychology of affairs in family annihilator cases often reveals a deeper pathology. It's not simply about dissatisfaction. It's about entitlement. Both Scott and Chris believed they deserved happiness, admiration, freedom, regardless of the cost to their families. They believed they were justified in seeking escape, even while maintaining the illusion of commitment. This entitlement is a hallmark of narcissistic thinking, the belief that one's needs outweigh the obligations to others, even to one's own children. For Lacey and Shanann, the betrayals were invisible until it was too late. Lacey never knew about Amber. Shanann suspected Chris was pulling away, but she never knew about Nichol until after the murders. Both women trusted their husbands, even as the men secretly plotted futures without them. And that's what makes these affairs so sinister. They weren't just betrayals of love, but betrayals of trust, of family, of the very foundation of marriage. In the end, both affairs collapsed under the weight of truth. Amber Frey went to police, horrified to learn the man she trusted was lying. Nichol Kessinger cooperated with investigators, devastated to discover Chris had murdered his family. But by then, the damage was done. The fantasies had become reality, and the women Scott and Chris claimed to love were gone forever. What these affairs reveal is not simply infidelity. They reveal the psychology of escape. For Scott and Chris, affairs weren't about love, they were about erasure. They wanted to erase their obligations, their families, their responsibilities. And when reality threatened to expose them, they chose annihilation. The affair is often the turning point in family annihilator cases, the moment when dissatisfaction transforms into danger. Because it is in the affair that the killer first practices the lie, "My family doesn't exist. My wife is gone. I am free." And once that lie is spoken enough times, once it is believed by someone else, it becomes easier to make it true. Scott Peterson rehearsed a world where Lacey was dead before she ever disappeared. Chris Watts rehearsed a world where Shannon no longer existed while she was still carrying his son. Both men lived in lies so deep that reality became expendable. And when the compartments of their double lives collapsed, they made the unthinkable choice to kill. Narcissism and control. When psychologists and the public dissect cases like Scott Peterson and Chris Watts, one word almost always rises to the surface: narcissism. Were these men narcissists? Were they sociopaths? Were they psychopaths? Or were they simply selfish, entitled men who chose evil when cornered? The truth lies somewhere between clinical diagnosis and human behavior. But what is undeniable is that both Scott and Chris displayed patterns of narcissistic thinking, and at the heart of that thinking was control. Narcissism isn't just vanity. It's not just taking selfies or loving attention. At its core, narcissism is about the self as the central character of the universe. It's about seeing other people as extensions of yourself rather than individuals with their own needs. And in both Scott Peterson and Chris Watts, we see this pattern play out in chilling ways. For Scott, the signs appeared early. Friends later recalled how he often spoke about his own needs and desires, but rarely about Lacey's. Even during Lacey's pregnancy, Scott seemed distant from the experience. While she was planning a nursery and dreaming of motherhood, he was consumed with golf outings and side relationships. The child was not a source of joy for him. It was a burden. In Scott's narcissistic framework, fatherhood meant losing freedom, losing admiration, losing control. And instead of embracing that reality, he began to devalue Lacey in his mind. For Chris Watts, narcissism revealed itself in quieter ways. He wasn't flamboyant like Scott. He wasn't outwardly charming in the same way. But he too saw his family as an extension of himself rather than individuals. Shannon's strong personality made him feel small, overshadowed, emasculated. Instead of valuing her drive and ambition, Chris resented it. Instead of appreciating the children as gifts, he saw them as responsibilities that robbed him of attention and freedom. In his narcissistic lens, his needs mattered most, even if it meant erasing the lives of his own daughters. Control is the thread that binds these cases together. For Scott, control meant managing two realities: Lacey at home, Amber in secret. It meant lying to everyone around him while keeping the narrative straight enough to avoid suspicion. Scott controlled appearances, controlling how he was seen by family, by friends, by Amber, by the media. Even after Lacey vanished, he tried to control perception, giving interviews, holding himself together, insisting on his innocence. He wasn't just lying. He was curating an image that Chris's need for control manifested differently. He was passive, quiet, emotionally withdrawn. But his control came through silence, through detachment, through denial. He ignored Shannon's pleas, refused to engage, starved her of affection. This was a form of emotional control, keeping her off balance, making her question herself. And when silence and detachment weren't enough, he escalated to the ultimate act of control, taking the lives of his wife and children. Narcissistic devaluation is a key concept here. In the narcissist cycle, a partner is first idealized, placed on a pedestal, adored, seen as perfect. But eventually, the narcissist becomes dissatisfied. The partner is then devalued, seen as controlling, nagging, suffocating. And finally, they are discarded, abandoned, replaced, or in these extreme cases, annihilated. Scott idealized Lacey in the beginning. He married her, built a home with her. But as pregnancy advanced, as responsibility grew, he devalued her. He described her as controlling. He spoke to Amber as if Lacey didn't exist. And ultimately, he discarded her completely. Chris idealized Shannon in the beginning. He played the role of the supportive husband. He appeared in her videos, smiled in family photos. But as her personality clashed with his passivity, as her ambitions highlighted his insecurities, he devalued her. He grew distant, resentful, detached. And ultimately, he too discarded her and their children in the most final way possible. But were they true narcissists, in the clinical sense? That's a more complicated question. Diagnosing narcissistic personality disorder requires patterns across time, relationships, and behavior. Some experts argue that Scott Peterson fits the profile: charming, manipulative, deceitful, lacking empathy, entitled to admiration. Chris Watts, however, is more debated. Some see him as a classic narcissist, others as a deeply insecure man who made horrific choices. What's clear is that both men displayed narcissistic traits. Whether or not they fit the full diagnosis, and those traits, entitlement, lack of empathy, devaluation, control, are common in family annihilator psychology. Control, again, is the centerpiece. Family annihilators often feel control slipping away. They feel trapped by financial stress, by fatherhood, by demanding partners, by lives they no longer want. Instead of accepting reality, instead of relinquishing control, they try to seize it back. And for some, that means murder. Think about the ultimate act of control, deciding who lives and who dies. By eliminating their families, men like Scott and Chris reclaim control. They no longer have to answer to their wives, care for their children, or confront their own inadequacies. In their distorted minds, annihilation is liberation. Scott Peterson didn't just want freedom, he wanted freedom without consequence. He wanted Amber without admitting divorce. He wanted to erase Lacey without facing judgment. By killing her, he controlled the narrative, at least temporarily. Chris Watts didn't just want Nichol. He wanted her without the baggage of children, without the burden of Shannon. Divorce would expose him, force him to explain himself, damage his image. Murder, in his mind, offered a cleaner escape. Horrific as it is, that was his logic. Annihilation as the ultimate control. The chilling truth is that narcissistic control doesn't always manifest in violence. Many narcissists simply manipulate, lie, cheat, discard. But in these extreme cases, when combined with resentment, affairs, and entitlement, it escalates to murder. The psychology of family killers like Scott and Chris shows us that beneath the surface of ordinary men can lie extraordinary selfishness. They may not look like predators, but their worldview is just as dangerous. Because when you see others not as people, but as obstacles to your own desires, empathy disappears. And when empathy disappears, anything is possible. This is the heart of the narcissism debate in these cases. Were they monsters, born without empathy? Or were they men who nurtured selfishness until it consumed them? Either way, the result is the same. Wives and children who trusted them paid the price for their need for control, and the world, deceived by their masks, was left asking, how did we not see it coming? Lies, media, and masks. If Scott Peterson and Chris Watts had one thing in common beyond their crimes, it was their uncanny ability to lie in public while wearing a mask of calm. Both men became central figures in media circuses, and both used the spotlight not to grieve, not to plead for justice, but to perform, to control, to manipulate perception. Scott Peterson's lies were woven into the very fabric of his life by the time Lacey disappeared. He had lied to Amber Frey about being single, lied to his family about golf trips, lied to friends about his marriage. But when Lacey went missing on Christmas Eve, his lies became national news. He stood before cameras as the grieving husband, insisting he had no idea where his pregnant wife had gone. He attended vigils, held Lacey's mother's hand, all while knowing he had already erased her. Chris Watts followed almost the same script 16 years later. Just days after Shannon and the girls vanished, he stood on his porch giving interviews to local reporters. He looked into the camera and begged for their safe return, describing the house as empty without them. He folded his arms, shifting his weight, and spoke with the detached calm of a man who knew exactly where his wife and children were, buried at an oil site hours away. The mask was never more visible than in those media moments. Scott wore the mask of the grieving husband, calm and composed, even as suspicion grew. Chris wore the mask of the worried father, arms crossed, speaking softly, even as investigators were closing in. Their lies were not panicked or sloppy. They were practiced, deliberate, and chilling in their normalcy. This is what psychologists call impression management. It's the deliberate attempt to shape how others perceive you. Narcissists and sociopaths excel at it. They know how to modulate their tone, their body language, their facial expressions to appear calm, rational, trustworthy. And in both Scott and Chris, we see impression management at its peak. But what makes their lies so haunting is how transparent they became upon review. Watch Scott's interviews now, and you see a man too composed, too rehearsed, his eyes darting as he speaks of Lacey in the past tense. Watch Chris's porch interview, and you see a man with folded arms, avoiding eye contact, speaking of his daughters in oddly detached phrases. At the time, many sensed something was off. In hindsight, it's undeniable. Why do killers like Scott and Chris lie so boldly, knowing the truth will eventually surface? Psychologists suggest it's partly arrogance. They believe they can outsmart investigators, outwit the public, control the narrative. And partly desperation. Once the lie begins, they feel trapped, unable to stop. Every new lie covers the last, until the truth is buried under layers of performance. For Scott, the unraveling came through Amber Frey. When police revealed his affair to the public, the mask cracked. The image of the grieving husband collapsed overnight. Suddenly, he wasn't a victim, he was a suspect. His calm demeanor, once seen as strength, became evidence of coldness. His lies, once overlooked, became proof of guilt. For Chris, the unraveling came in the interrogation room. His lies began to falter under pressure. First, he insisted Shannon had taken the girls somewhere. Then he suggested she had harmed them, projecting his own violence onto her. But the polygraph test broke him. When confronted with the evidence, his carefully built mask shattered. In that moment, the world saw not a grieving father, but a killer cornered by truth. The psychology of lying in these cases goes deeper than simple deception. It reveals how killers view themselves. Scott believed he could maintain two realities indefinitely. He thought he could be Amber's widower and Modesto's grieving husband simultaneously. Chris believed he could erase Shannon and the girls and slip seamlessly into a new life with Nichol. Both underestimated the power of evidence, of police persistence, of public scrutiny. The role of media in these cases cannot be overstated. Both Scott and Chris inserted themselves into the narrative through interviews, hoping to control the story. But those very appearances became damning. The public noticed their calmness, their odd phrasing, their lack of authentic emotion. While they tried to mask their guilt, the mask itself became suspicious. This paradox is key. Killers often believe their lies make them look innocent, but it is the very act of lying so boldly that exposes them. Scott's composure looked less like strength and more like indifference. Chris's calm looked less like control and more like emptiness. In the theater of true crime, their performances became their undoing. What's perhaps most chilling is the intimacy of their lies. They didn't just lie to the public. They lied to family members, to friends, to their wives' grieving relatives. Scott sat in Lacey's parents' living room, pretending to mourn, all while hiding his betrayal. Chris sat across from Shannon's best friends, insisting he didn't know where she was, even as he knew her body lay buried. These weren't abstract lies. They were direct assaults on the people who loved their victims most. And in both cases, the lies stripped them of any chance at sympathy. Had Scott admitted dissatisfaction, had Chris filed for divorce, their lives would have been messy but survivable. Instead, their lies created a spiral from which there was no return. Once they chose murder, the lies became their only shield, and that shield crumbled under the weight of reality. The lesson from these cases is clear. When someone controls appearances too carefully, when their calm seems rehearsed, when their story doesn't match their eyes, something is wrong. The mask may look convincing, but masks always crack. Scott Peterson's mask cracked when Amber came forward. Chris Watts' mask cracked in the interrogation room. And once the cracks appeared, the world saw not grieving husbands, but family annihilators who believed their lies could erase the truth. The turning point. Every mask eventually slips. Every double life eventually collides. For Scott Peterson and Chris Watts, There came a moment when the walls closed in, when their carefully built illusions collapsed, when the lies could no longer hold. These moments, the turning points, were not just about police work or evidence. They were about psychology, about men who believed they were smarter than everyone else, suddenly realizing they were not. For Scott, the turning point began with suspicion, but it solidified with a name, Amber Frey. When Amber discovered that Scott's wife was not only alive but missing, the fantasy Scott had crafted came crashing down. She contacted police, horrified, and agreed to cooperate. Suddenly, Scott's private lie became public scandal. The grieving husband mask dissolved overnight. No longer was he the charming husband searching for his pregnant wife. He was the adulterer, the liar, the man living a double life. That Amber's cooperation was devastating for Scott. The recorded phone calls between them, where he spun lie after lie, revealed not just deceit, but a complete lack of concern for Lacey and Connor. Instead of focusing on the search, Scott was busy convincing Amber of his love, crafting stories about being in Paris for New Year's, trying to keep her in his orbit. These tapes weren't just evidence, they were windows into his psychology. They showed a man so consumed with preserving his fantasy life that his missing wife became a background inconvenience. For Chris, the turning point came in August 2018, when Shannon and the girls disappeared. At first, Chris thought he could control the narrative. He called Shannon's friends, he allowed police into his home, he even gave interviews. But from the very beginning, investigators sensed something was off. The house showed no signs of struggle. Shannon's belongings were left behind. Chris's demeanor seemed wrong, and when confronted with pointed questions, his answers rang hollow. The pressure began to mount. Shannon's friends, particularly Nichol Atkinson, refused to accept Chris's explanations. They pushed the police, demanded answers, kept the spotlight burning. Unlike Scott, who lived in a time before social media amplified every clue, Chris faced a world where every interview, every movement, every word could be scrutinized instantly by millions. His calm, his detachment, his odd phrasing, they all became red flags in real time. The true breaking point for Chris came in the interrogation room with the polygraph test. Investigators knew he was lying. The polygraph confirmed it. When the results were revealed, the mask shattered. Chris's story shifted. He tried to project blame onto Shannon, claiming she had harmed the children and that he had only killed her in response. It was a desperate, clumsy attempt at deflection. But the lie didn't hold. Too much evidence pointed directly to him. And in that moment, Chris realized the walls had closed in. What these turning points reveal is a pattern common to many family annihilators, the belief that they can control the narrative indefinitely, followed by the sudden realization that reality is stronger than lies. Scott believed he could keep Amber and hide Lacey's disappearance. But once Amber spoke to police, his mask collapsed. Every public appearance became suspicious. Every calm interview became evidence of guilt. His fantasy life couldn't survive the scrutiny of truth. Chris believed he could erase Shannon and the girls and walk seamlessly into a new life with Nichol. But once investigators began pressing, once the polygraph shattered his calm, once his own words betrayed him, his mask collapsed. His double life was exposed not by one dramatic reveal, but by the accumulation of small details he could no longer explain. These turning points are also revealing in another way. They show us how killers respond when the illusion of control disappears. Scott doubled down. Even as suspicion grew, he continued to call Amber, continued to lie, continued to insist on his innocence publicly. He fled south toward the Mexican border with thousands of dollars in cash, dyed hair, and multiple cell phones. To the very end, he believed he could outmaneuver the system, control perception, rewrite reality. His narcissism was so entrenched that even as the world saw him as guilty, he refused to admit it. Chris, by contrast, folded. Once the polygraph broke him, once investigators pushed harder, he shifted blame desperately and then eventually confessed. His need for control collapsed under pressure. Unlike Scott, who maintained denial, Chris surrendered the truth when faced with the undeniable. But that surrender didn't come from remorse. It came from inevitability. He confessed because he had no other choice, not because empathy had suddenly appeared. The psychology of the turning point is fascinating. Up until that moment, killers like Scott and Chris believe they are smarter than everyone else. They believe they can control wives, mistresses, families, police, media. But the turning point forces them to confront reality. And reality always wins. For Scott, the reality was Amber's voice on wiretaps, exposing his double life to the world. For Chris, the reality was a polygraph examiner saying, "You failed." Both moments stripped away the illusion. Both men stood exposed, not as grieving husbands, but as liars caught in their own webs. The turning point also serves a critical function for us, the public. It is the moment when suspicion becomes certainty, when we no longer wrestle with doubt, when the mask falls away and the monster is revealed. For Lacey's family, that moment was when Amber came forward. For Shanann's friends, it was when Chris shifted blame onto her. These were the moments when grief turned to rage, when love turned to betrayal. And yet, even after the mask slipped, both men tried to hold on. Scott insisted he was innocent, even as the evidence mounted. Chris insisted Shanann had harmed the children, even as the truth was clear. Their refusal to accept responsibility, even at the end, reveals the core of their psychology. Control mattered more than truth. They would rather live in lies than confront reality. This is why turning points in family annihilator cases are so pivotal. They reveal not just the collapse of lies, but the essence of the killer's mind. When cornered, Scott ran deeper into deception. Chris crumbled and confessed. Both outcomes different, but both rooted in the same truth. Control had slipped through their fingers, and without control, they had nothing. The illusion was gone. The mask was broken, and the world finally saw the men for what they truly were. Psychology of murder. Why they snapped. When people look back at the stories of Scott Peterson and Chris Watts, one of the most haunting questions that lingers is not whether they did it. We know they did, but why? Why did two men who had everything to live for, wives who loved them, children who trusted them, homes that seemed stable and ordinary, make the decision to erase it all? Why did they kill, not strangers, but their own families? Psychologists have studied this dark phenomenon for decades, trying to understand the motives of family annihilators. The answers are never simple, but patterns emerge. In criminology, experts often describe four broad categories of family annihilators: the self-righteous, the anomic, the disappointed, and the paranoid. Each type reveals a different distorted mindset, a different rationale for murder. And while no two cases are exactly alike, when we apply this framework to Scott Peterson and Chris Watts, we begin to see how their inner worlds collapsed into violence. Scott Peterson's psychology reveals elements of both the anomic and the self-righteous killer. To the anomic type, family is tied directly to stability, to image, to economic success. When that stability is threatened, they see their family as disposable. For Scott, fatherhood was not a blessing but a burden. Lacey's pregnancy, which should have been the happiest chapter of their marriage, felt to him like a trap closing in. He saw not the joy of a child's laughter, but the weight of responsibility, the end of freedom, the finality of adulthood. His affair with Amber Frey wasn't simply about attraction, it was about fantasy. With Amber, Scott could play the role of the carefree bachelor, unburdened by fatherhood, unchained from marriage. He could be anyone he wanted to be, because in that fantasy, Lacey and Connor didn't exist. But the self-righteous element also loomed large in Scott's psyche. This type of annihilator blames their partner for their unhappiness, framing them as the problem. In Scott's distorted view, Lacey was controlling, demanding, suffocating. He cast himself as the victim, even as he betrayed her. This mindset allowed him to rationalize her elimination, not as cruelty, but as liberation. In his narcissistic frame, he wasn't a murderer. He was a man reclaiming his freedom. It is chilling to consider that Scott rehearsed this world long before Lacey vanished. Every time he lied to Amber, every time he told her he was free, every time he pictured a life without Lacey, he was practicing erasure. By the time December came, the fantasy felt real enough that he decided to make it so. Chris Watts, though outwardly very different from Scott, reveals another blend of types. He fits most closely with the self-righteous and the disappointed killer. Unlike Scott, who projected charm and arrogance, Chris was quiet, passive, seemingly gentle. But beneath the surface, resentment brewed. Shannon was outspoken, organized, ambitious. Chris was soft-spoken, conflict-avoidant, a man who kept his feelings bottled up until they poisoned him. In his confession, Chris blamed Shannon, claiming she was suffocating him, controlling him, and even suggesting she had harmed the children before he did. This was the self-righteous script, shifting blame to her, framing himself as the victim who had no choice but to respond. It was a grotesque distortion, but it shows how Chris's mind worked. He couldn't accept responsibility, so he projected it outward, but Chris was also deeply disappointed. This type of killer is motivated by disillusionment, by the belief that their family has failed to meet their expectations. For Chris, that disappointment centered around image and desire. He wanted a new life with Nichol Kessinger, one where he was admired, wanted, free from obligation. Shannon's strong personality, which once attracted him, became intolerable. The children, once the center of his world, became obstacles to the fantasy he was building. In his affair, Chris felt alive, desired, powerful. At home, he felt small, trapped, unseen. That gap widened until the life he had no longer seemed bearable. And in that gap, murder became his twisted solution. The word snap is often used in these cases, but the reality is more complicated. Men like Scott Peterson don't always snap in an instant. Their decisions brew over time, a slow burn of resentment and fantasy that eventually crystallizes into action. Scott's crime was calculated, rehearsed, planned. It wasn't an explosion of rage, but a cold erasure, the execution of a decision he had already made in his mind. For Chris, the eruption looked more impulsive. His actions were sloppy, desperate, poorly concealed. But even his crime didn't come out of nowhere. The seeds had been planted for months as he grew more detached, as his affair deepened, as his silence toward Shannon became more chilling. When the confrontation finally came, his suppressed resentment burst out, and the result was annihilation. The heart of both men's psychology is entitlement. Divorce was an option. Separation was an option. Honesty was an option. But those choices would have required humility. They would have required facing shame, judgment, financial loss, social fallout. And for men like Scott and Chris, those costs were unacceptable. They wanted freedom without consequence, escape without sacrifice. Murder, in their distorted minds, offered the cleanest escape. It allowed them to silence their wives, erase their families, and walk into their fantasies unchallenged. It is selfishness elevated to the level of atrocity. Narcissism plays a powerful role here, not necessarily in the clinical sense of a personality disorder, but in the traits both men displayed. Narcissists crave admiration, control, validation. They cannot tolerate rejection or limitation. When their families no longer reflected back the image they wanted, when their wives demanded too much, when fatherhood demanded sacrifice, they turned against them. In the narcissistic lens, other people exist to serve the self. When they stop serving, they become disposable. And when they are disposable, annihilation becomes thinkable. What is perhaps most terrifying is how ordinary both men looked while nurturing these thoughts. Scott smiled at vigils, held hands with Lacey's mother, played the role of the grieving husband even as he dreamed of Paris with Amber. Chris hugged his daughters on camera, appeared in Shannon's videos, gave porch interviews pleading for their return, all while knowing he had buried them hours earlier. They looked normal because the mask was intact, and behind the mask, the entitlement festered until it erupted in violence. The psychology of family annihilation reminds us that murder, in these cases, is less about hatred and more about erasure. Scott didn't kill because he hated Lacey. Chris didn't kill because he hated Shannon. They killed because their families no longer fit the fantasies they wanted to live. Their wives and children became obstacles to a new identity. And in their warped logic, the solution was not honesty, not courage, but annihilation. Think of the ultimate act of control, deciding who lives and who dies. For men like Scott Peterson and Chris Watts, murder was not just violence. It was a final declaration of power. By eliminating their families, they reclaimed control over lives they felt were slipping away. By burying their wives, by discarding their children, they silenced the voices that reminded them of their inadequacies. In their minds, annihilation was liberation. This is why their calmness is so disturbing. It was not the calm of innocence. It was the calm of men who had made their choice. Scott played golf in the days after Lacey vanished. Chris gave interviews in the days after Shannon and the girls were gone. These weren't accidents. They were demonstrations of control. The mask still mattered. The performance still mattered. But beneath it all, the psychology was already exposed. Men so consumed with themselves that they could erase the very people who trusted them most. And when we ask why they snapped, the truth is simple but horrifying. They didn't snap because they were overwhelmed with grief. They didn't snap because of a sudden rage. They snapped because the fantasy of freedom collided with the reality of family. And when forced to choose, they chose themselves. Reflection. When we reflect on the cases of Scott Peterson and Chris Watts, it is tempting to see them as rare anomalies, monsters hiding in plain sight. But the truth is far more unsettling. They were not strangers in the night, not masked intruders, not serial predators lurking in alleys. They were husbands. They were fathers. They were men who waved to neighbors, who smiled in family photos, who seemed ordinary until they weren't. And that ordinariness is what chills us most. Both Scott and Chris crafted the illusion of the perfect husband. Both projected an image of family stability, of domestic bliss, of men who had it all. But behind the curtain, both nurtured dissatisfaction, resentment, and fantasies of freedom. Their wives, Lacey and Shannon, loved them deeply, trusted them fully, and never imagined the danger that lived inside their own homes. That betrayal is what makes these crimes unforgettable. Because it wasn't just the loss of life, it was the shattering of trust, the revelation that sometimes the greatest threat comes not from outside, but from within. What do these cases teach us? First, they reveal the danger of the mask of normalcy. We often assume that killers will look different, act different, feel different. But Scott attended vigils for Lacey, playing the grieving husband while she lay at the bottom of the bay. Chris hugged his daughters on video, then hours later placed their small bodies into oil tanks. The mask is convincing because it is designed to be. And when someone is invested in maintaining appearances, when their calmness feels rehearsed, when their story feels too smooth, it may be a sign that something darker lies beneath. Second, these cases reveal the role of entitlement and control. Both men saw their families not as individuals with their own needs and dreams, but as extensions of themselves. When Lacey's pregnancy represented responsibility, Scott erased it. When Shannon's strength made Chris feel small, he destroyed it. In their distorted worlds, the needs of others were irrelevant. What mattered was their own freedom, their own image, their own desires. And when those desires collided with reality, they chose annihilation. Third, they remind us of the importance of warning signs. Shannon sensed something was wrong. Her texts revealed her confusion, her pain, her growing awareness that Chris was pulling away. Friends noticed Scott's detachment, his lack of enthusiasm about fatherhood, his excuses. These signs, in isolation, might have seemed ordinary. Relationships struggle, people grow distant. But in hindsight, they were markers on the path to tragedy. Recognizing patterns of withdrawal, secrecy, gaslighting, or sudden detachment may be the only chance we have to intervene before it is too late. But perhaps the most profound lesson is this: love should never confuse you. Love should not make you doubt your worth, question your sanity, or feel like you are walking on eggshells. Love should not isolate you, starve you of affection, or leave you begging for attention. True love builds, it nurtures, it strengthens. When love becomes conditional, when affection is withheld as punishment, when silence replaces communication, it may not be love at all. It may be manipulation. And in the worst cases, it may be a mask hiding danger. As we reflect on Scott Peterson and Chris Watts, it is easy to demonize them and move on. But their crimes force us to confront uncomfortable truths about human psychology. They force us to ask how ordinary dissatisfaction can curdle into annihilation. They force us to see how entitlement, narcissism, and fantasy can grow unchecked behind closed doors. And they remind us that evil doesn't always look like evil. Sometimes it looks like a smile, a handshake, a neighbor mowing his lawn. These stories haunt us because they touch something universal: marriage, parenthood, trust. We all want to believe that home is the safest place, that the people we love most will protect us. When that trust is broken in the most violent way, It shakes our faith in humanity itself. That is why these cases endure, why they fascinate and terrify us decades later. Because they show us the darkest side of ordinary life. So what do we do with this knowledge? We use it. We stay aware. We pay attention to patterns of control, secrecy, and detachment. We support those who voice their fears rather than dismissing them. We remember that appearances can be deceiving, that masks can be convincing, that calmness can be chilling. And above all, we remind ourselves that awareness is protection. Knowledge is defense. Truth, no matter how dark, is the first step towards safety. As we close this episode, I want to thank you for staying with me through this long, difficult journey. These aren't easy stories to tell, and they aren't easy stories to hear. But they matter because by understanding them, we can protect ourselves and others. By dissecting the psychology of family killers, we expose the patterns that might save a life in the future. If this episode resonated with you, if it gave you clarity or opened your eyes to warning signs, I ask you to do one thing. Share it. Share it with someone who might need to hear it. Share it with someone who has ever doubted their instincts, who has ever felt confused by the mask of a loved one. Sometimes one story can spark awareness, and awareness can prevent tragedy. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to this channel. We don't just tell stories. We analyze them. We dig deep into psychology. We connect the dots between crime and human behavior. By subscribing, you ensure you don't miss the next case, the next lesson, the next truth we uncover. For those who want to go even deeper, I invite you to join as a channel member. Membership supports the long hours of research and writing that go into creating these in-depth documentaries. And in return, you'll gain exclusive perks, the ability to suggest cases, to vote on what we cover next, and to see behind-the-scenes updates about the process. Think of it as becoming part of the investigation yourself, helping decide which dark truths we bring into the light. Because in the next episode, we will continue exploring the psychology of family annihilators. We'll ask what drives ordinary men, fathers, husbands, neighbors, to commit extraordinary crimes. And we'll compare patterns across cases, from Neil Entwistle to Chad Duerman, to see what connects them and what makes each story unique. It is a journey into the darkest corners of the human mind, and I promise you, you won't want to miss it. So hit subscribe, tap the bell, click join if you want to take part in shaping this channel's future. And above all, remember, masks can be deceiving, but truth has a way of breaking through. Because in a world where killers thrive on silence, the most powerful weapon we have is to speak the truth aloud.